It's been a long time since I've actually recorded a YouTube video, and I wanted to take a chance to answer this question about does XXXY determine sex because I see it everywhere. And in general, the answer is a sure, yes and no. It's more complicated than just that, but the reason I wanted to bring this up is because of the recent CAS report that was commissioned by England to study the use of hormone therapy or puberty blockers in youth. And so I pull from that on a few parts of this discussion. And let me at least introduce a little bit of what the CAS report talks about. I spent a huge amount of time in section 6 of the CAS report, and I got a few criticisms to make here. And the first one is really actually in section 6.4. And the very first statement that it says there is biological sex is determined by sex chromosomes, and they talk about the XY and XX and going from there. Now, there's a couple of caveats here. They make the statement biological sex is determined by sex chromosomes, but then later on they talk about in early pregnancy, all fetuses have the potential. So everybody has the potential to become male or female. And then the next part, it says a gene on the Y chromosome drives production of testosterone, which is necessary to produce internal and external male genitalia. In the absence of testosterone, the fetus will develop female anatomy. So the caveat with this is they say that chromosomes determine sex, but then later on say, well, it's actually this gene on the Y chromosome. And later on they say, well, it's actually the testosterone that actually does this or not. So which is it? You say biological sex is determined by X or XY, and yet here we see, even in the CAS report, that that doesn't always apply. So, and then the next part about this is they take into the next section, sex differences in the brain emerge in the second half of pregnancy. There is strong evidence from animal studies that these changes are driven by the presence or absence of testosterone and have a long-term effect on sex type development. And they reference this article from 2014. And basically, what they do with these animal studies in mice is they take away the testosterone. They leave the XY chromosome, they take away the testosterone, and they see what happens with the behaviors of these mice. And the effect of that is a long term effect on the brain that it's going to be male developed or female developed. In the absence of testosterone, it's going to be female developed. And then they talk about some of the other characteristics that happen in the midst of all this have been found to relate to early testosterone exposure. So if you mess up testosterone, if the timing is off, if it's too early or if it's too late, you can alter somebody's brain development just based off of that alone. So the next part of this is that it talks about biological characteristics such as height. There's a large overlap in gender role behaviors. So going back to that very beginning, 6.4, where we talk about the potential for males and females, the development is always there. The fetus can develop into either male or female, regardless of the XX or the XY that's present. And we can see that in a lot of different differences in sexual development. There's variability in gender role expression exists from an early age. And this is talking about toy play. There's a massive overlap, and we got to keep in mind that when we apply expectations on a child about what toys they should play with, we may or may not cater to their early development, their brain development. So we have to realize that regardless of who they are, what sex they're assigned at birth, there is a massive overlap of gender role play, gender expression, in how we develop. Now, the biggest point of this is that there's a long-term effect on sex type development as done in animal studies. So first thing we got to look at is chromosomes in themselves. Chromosomes are nothing more than storage structures. That's all they are. There's 23 pairs in humans for a total of 46. They are numbered from 1 to 22 based off of size, and then there's XY. And chromosome 1 has approximately 250 million base pairs. And I misspelled chromosome 22, has 51 million base pairs. So when we start out with this concept of biologic sex, these chromosomes are nothing more than storage structures. It's just like a hard drive in a computer or a USB drive or a thumb drive or whatever you want to call it. The data on those drives is useless without the application of that data. It's the same thing with the chromosomes. We bring together these chromosomes during conception, and in of themselves, they mean nothing until the human development process occurs. And that's determined not by the chromosomes themselves, but the genes that are on them. In general, you would expect that an XX individual would develop into female and an XY individual would develop as male assigned at birth. That is an overall expectation. However, we also need to be mindful that there are differences in brain development that do happen as a consequence of all this development. So, getting back to that, biological sex is yes and no. Determined by the sex chromosomes. It's determined by the genes, and more importantly, the overall process from conception onward. So we take the data, we process it all, and then we end up with the human result afterwards. So oftentimes we think of it in this pathway here. We think biological sex develops from XY equals male, XX equals female. And we forget that there's a huge, massive process underneath all of this as well. And then we also need to realize that there is this very strong, in early pregnancy, all fetuses have the potential to become male or female. The genes that lead into human development, human sex development, there's hundreds of them that are at play here. Not just one, not just two, but literally hundreds. And any one of them can be altered in the process of all this. And so here's how biologic sex actually develops. We have a bipotential gonad. We have this typical. There are exceptions to these rules. This is a simplified version in of itself, where the testes is the gonad that develops. And really what happens is more actually towards the right. And you'll kind of see these hormones come along here. AMH here, testosterone is produced from the testes. The estrogen is produced from the ovary. What happens is here is that bipotential gonad, the genital ridge, the mesonephros and the paramesonephros. It all comes down to, well, the SRY gene, yes, but really it's what happens next in this SOX9. SRY is nothing more than an activator. It's a light switch. It turns on the machinery that leads to male development. And that really is centered around SOX9. So it's not just the genital ridge, it's not just SRY, it's the next gene down that makes the biggest difference. SOX9 auto activates itself. It sets itself into overdrive. That's why you see the circle above it. It's activating itself. Once it does that, it sends out anti-Mullerian hormone, and you can see that there's this activation pathway, this signaling pathway from SF1. Anti-Mullerian hormone comes down here and represses the paramesonephros pathway so that female development does not occur. So not only do you have to have activation and enhancement of the male pathway, you have to have regression of the female pathway. And it's vice versa. What happens with the female pathway is that as you go from RSP01 to beta-catenin and WNT4, notice that these are suppressing SOX9. The female pathway intentionally represses the male pathway. It's not an all or none. It literally has to repress that development. And as a consequence, you can get alterations in any one of these pathways and get variations on a human being developed. Now, as you can see with this, when we're talking about brain development up here in that CAS report, sex differences in the brain emerge in early pregnancy. If there are alterations in this pathway, in any one of these pathways, you can get differences in brain development compared to gonadal development, so that a brain can masculinize when it was expected to feminize, or vice versa. They are not necessarily interconnected directly. They're connected by the testosterone. We also have to realize that biologic sex is way more involved than just looking at the gonads. We need to look at the brain development, the pituitary gland, the adrenal glands, hormones, genetics, internal anatomy, external anatomy, gonads, and gametes. This whole collective of what makes us up. It means that we need to stop looking at one individual aspect of ourselves and see this whole group of things that make us who we are. There are thousands of genes involved in the development of these structures, not just one, not just two, but literally thousands. So coming back to that, biologic sex is determined by the chromosomes. Yeah, seems contradictory based on the current writing. Based off of the information that we have available to us, we need to stop thinking of the development down this pathway and start thinking it more as this. But it is very complex. Gender identity seems clearly associated with testosterone exposure, and there are sex differences of the brain. We see that in the imaging studies. We already know that there's a very large variability of gender roles. So in of itself, the thing I critique about the CAS report is that it confirms a lot of the existence of these conditions, this development, this gender identity, these gender roles, that there's extreme variability between all of these things, and that there's a significant diversity of humans and the variability of gender roles. And yet, at the conclusion of this CAS report, they basically say we don't have enough information. We have lots of information. It's just not carried through this report. So I want to carry more videos about this report. I want to do some more critiquing of it. This was my first adventure into talking about this. So thank you.